everybody. Welcome back to the Brando and Joe podcast. Our guest today is Rory O'Gallagher. He received his master's in IO psychology from Baruch College and currently works at GE HealthCare as a senior behavioral scientist. Welcome, Rory. Thanks
Welcome.
for joining us.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and Happy New Year, too. This is actually our first podcast after the new
Oh yeah.
year. Who thought we'd make it this far? I bet people took
Hopefully, I can help
bets
you
that
get
we
it started
wouldn't.
off right. Yeah.
Thank you. Do you have any New Year's resolutions? I honestly don't remember the last time.
Yeah, and that's a fun goals conversation right there. For me, I try to set mine a little bit more on like a monthly basis as opposed to annual. Um, I don't look at stuff usually. Like I'm sure I have annual or what are considered bigger goals, but I just don't usually think about them like right at the start of the year. It'll just be like when I have the downtime to think about like, hey, what am I doing in my life? So.
What about you, Brandon? That's a fair response.
I think we've just got to get through the next 6 months and get our degrees, and then from there,
That's a good resolution.
Yeah.
And then we can take a really good long think about it.
Yeah, it's going to be hard enough. I know. I still can't believe that we're going to graduate in 6 months.
Time
That's
flies.
It really is. But yes, thank you for joining us, Rory. We're excited to talk to you about your job career and how you've come so far. We were doing like our usual LinkedIn dive in, and it seems like you get to do like a lot of cool stuff. We were talking about beforehand that I feel like a lot of the stuff you do, we did in like one of our classes, whether it's like employee surveys and like the data. But my first question that I wanted to ask you, which I found interesting, is your title is Senior Behavioral Scientist, correct?
That's right. For right now, it is. Yeah.
So, and then I feel like the stuff you do, I always found in like a org effectiveness role, or I just haven't seen that like title before. Is that like a unique title for your company? Or sometimes we get the answer that it's like titles are titles and it's like you could find the duties of that job and like under any title.
I probably somewhere in between. I think you probably find there's usually like three different types of people who are in people analytics teams. You have data scientists, behavioral scientists, and I feel like I'm forgetting the third. It'll come back to me as we go. But like the people who are in behavioral science roles often have an IO psych background or some other like applied social psych background. Sometimes they're called behavioral scientists. Sometimes they're called a people analyst or a people analytics specialist or something like that. It really can be probably anywhere between 5 or 10 different titles that you find people with an IO background going into who sort of fit in between a data scientist who's usually the ones playing with models, doing a lot of the data analysis, whereas we focus maybe on some of that stuff, but also on a lot of the things that we typically learn in a grad program, like a lot of the system design, how are we collecting the data, how are we dealing with a lot of the biases in the process. So yeah, it's one of many, I would say.
Talking about like the work that you do, and you kind of mentioned the data side of it. So as like our degrees in IO, we always talk about the importance of data storytelling. Joe and I have talked about it a lot here on this podcast. What's kind of been your experience with like working with data and you learning how to data storytell, and where did you kind of get the experience from with your degree to really do that like data storytelling at your job?
Unfortunately, this may not be the best answer or the one that people are looking for, or maybe it is, but I definitely don't feel like I got the data storytelling skill built very well in my degree. I think we learned how to do analyses with often data sets that were already somewhat clean, and they were specific projects that we were put onto, so it all felt very structured, and that was great from a learning perspective. However, the realities of getting into a job, especially I've in the past 4 years had a very large scope of different projects I've had to get involved in. And so one of the number one sort of enemies to productivity and delivering on some of the things I do has often been the fact that there is so much data and just joining it together to answer very specific questions that are often hypothesis driven can become difficult. Like that's just not exactly the way that all organizations operate, where it's like, let's come up with a hypothesis and try to test it. Oftentimes it's a lot of very inductive data analysis where it's like, let's just try to explore what some of the things in here are. And while I've done that a number of times, I don't always find that it holds a lot of value. I think to your point, like the data storytelling where we have ideas of what we're looking to go in and test, even if we do exploratory data analysis, we at least still know here are the 3 or 4 things we have to answer and prioritize before we look at any other questions that come up when we're interacting with stakeholders in the business. That has helped me over time become much more successful in telling cohesive stories, because otherwise, whether it's text data, whether it's numerical data that you're looking at from total rewards, from employee sentiment data, I mean, you can get lost in it so quickly and your head is spinning and you actually don't know what story to tell at that point. And I've actually had that experience on a few different projects. So trying to learn from those and take a step back and realize like the structure as you're scoping out a project or getting involved is just as important as the analytics techniques that you choose to use down the road and the visuals and narratives you use. It all starts at the top.
You kind of answered my next question already about like, have you ever just looked at a data set and you're like, uh oh, I have no idea. Because then is it basically just like, all right, guys, we got to come up with something, or no, we have to tell maybe not the executive, but like maybe like go to a manager and be like, listen, like we're seeing nothing.
Yeah. Oh, I feel like there was definitely a project early on. I think there's a project I had to do where we were trying to understand. It was an org effectiveness study, and we were working with an engineering team, a big one. It was engineers, and I think product management function as well for our digital business. And there's a couple of data sets that we got a hold of, and we were trying to explore and do an assessment. And it took a long time to get through it. The data set was not the cleanest, as is often the case in the real world. Um, but but yeah, like you often do hit a moment if you didn't do a good enough job, which in this case, in this particular project, I think we did an okay job of scoping out exactly what we were going to look at when we dug into this data. You do kind of have that oh crap moment where you're like, all right, we're going to answer like one question for them, but I don't think that's enough. Like we got to pull something else out of this to make sure it didn't feel like a waste of our time, especially when you exist in the HR side and you're like, okay, well, I'm not revenue producing, so I need to make people feel like I'm spending my time correctly, to make sure that the cost is justified. That's an interesting thought that kind of crosses your head as you're working in the industry too. But that has happened probably a couple times. I had to learn from that very quickly because you get into these very embarrassing situations where you're like scrambling, you're panicking, and then you get into the meeting and you're like, I don't know if I'm really adding enough value here when I could have just gone and worked on a different project, or I could have structured this project a little bit differently to spend less time on it and to set people's expectations a little bit better.
It's it's true, and I like how you used that example, Rory, especially talking about early career struggles. Sometimes, like we come out and we try to like apply the stuff we've been learning, and it doesn't always come out the same way in the real world that it did with like a data set that our professor might have made up on the spot to make it seem some type of way.
Right, right.
But the one thread I wanted to pull at what you were saying there is just kind of the concept around like when it doesn't work and being in that moment early in your career. What can you kind of speak to as someone who's experienced that early in your career and how you can like take them as learning moments and grow from them?
Um, how did I learn from those moments? It was definitely, I think some of my initial learnings were like, debriefs with my team to talk about how those meetings went. And it's often very difficult after you've done a project with people to debrief. I think I learned this when I was doing a performance management course. And the book that we were using talked about how, like, when people are most receptive to feedback as a primer for the next project they're about to do, they are least receptive to feedback right after they finish. That's when they're most likely to get defensive. So, and like some of the debriefs we did definitely didn't really help me learn as much as I wanted to. And one of the sort of exercises or sort of mind tricks I try to play with teams when I'm debriefing now is I'll try to change the frame of reference instead of making it as much about the project we just completed, to get people thinking about like a hypothetical next project we're going to do, and we'll talk about like what will we do differently and how will this project unfold differently as a result. And that's helped in a couple instances where I've done that more recently. To see if I can more directly answer your question in terms of like how did I learn from that, I think there's the debriefs, there's the actually getting people feedback from people, which is difficult both on a personal level. Like as open as one might be to getting feedback, it's still to some extent always hurts. even if it's going to be helpful to you. It's just difficult to stay in sort of that growth mindset all the time. Um, the other thing as well, and I think I talk about this with people generally, of like what I feel like my ideal learning process is like whether it's a new skill I'm learning or a new project that I'm getting involved in. In the past, I feel like I always wanted to know everything before I jumped in to make sure I was prepared. Important thing is you want to set up sort of some safe to fail circumstances or scenarios that you can experiment with and like test out with people, get feedback early on things. And then after I've gone through that, which I can talk about a few examples after I kind of explain this at a high level. The next part is like, okay, how can I actually formally teach myself a little bit better on a particular subject? So you kind of have to make yourself curious and understand why you even care about this, because you kind of go through that lesson of humility of like, I screwed this up and there's something to be learned here. And then when you go back and you find new resources, new books that you either get from grad school, from other people that, have had similar struggles, like the learning that you get from those concepts is much stickier because you're not just reading a book, you're actually reflecting back on some prior experience you had at that point. So it's sort of like get some experience, then get some formal education, and kind of rinse and repeat that cycle to some extent. um and where that's been helpful for me as well is like I've done a lot of traditional IO work in my job. I've helped with analyzing 360 assessments. I have helped with doing lots of survey design stuff, but I've also been teaching myself a lot in the data science space, and more so recently in the last sort of year and a half, a lot in the text analytics and AI space. And what was a hard lesson to learn was like I wasted a lot of time looking at stuff before I went and showed it to people, got their feedback, and then continued to teach myself through more formal courses and books and things where I could like really learn how to do this stuff correctly after I kind of experimented with it. So I wasted a lot of time doing that. And text analytics is notoriously dangerous in the sense that like while you might look at a data set for total rewards and you might be like, okay, I think, if I just make an example of, I think that that Joe needs to be in XYZ comp range for XYZ region because the logistic regression said so. When you go and look at text data and you're trying to make a decision off that, like it is so unstructured, it is so impossible to learn from that. You can ask yourself 50 questions. And if you don't at least get feedback early on and then also figure out like, all right, well, what am I not learning from this and where can I get a resource to help me do this more efficiently? That ends up being the best approach. So I think that's a little bit of a tangent, but I hope that's at least helpful.
We love the tangents, Joe, and I always do. But no,
Yeah.
I love the humility side of what you're saying there, Rory, because it's like sometimes people think it's rainbows and sunshines when they get out of grad school, and
Yeah,
like there's some stuff that you got to learn, and it is a steep learning curve sometimes depending on the role you get, because
totally.
you can't have everything. So like Joe and I, and I'm sure all of our listeners would appreciate that like candid way of speaking that you were having there.
Yeah.
I want to point out too, like the big overall thing that I took is that you kept learning, and like Brandon said it as well. I think there's a whole bunch of people that like once they get the job, which is great and all, and then you get the job and then you start working, but then you're like, all right, I got the job now. School's done. I'm never gonna like look at a article again or like like a video or a tutorial. But it sounds like you're continuing to learn, especially with like the rise of AI, and you're learning how to like implement AI. I think that's just a great lesson overall, because I feel like once you stop that learning, you could tend to maybe fall behind is not the right word, um, but there's a whole bunch of new things that start coming out,
Oh yeah.
and if you're not like up to date, we actually had a couple episodes about that where people say like, no, there's like the current world is always changing, and the future of work might look so different, and future is a broad term because it might be the next year.
Right. Right. Yeah. And to be real with you guys, like I definitely fell into a little bit of that trap of like I got my job and I was teaching myself some skills, but a lot of how I learn is through sort of making new connections with people out in industry and constantly trying to find people to learn from and events to go to. It's how I've got this job was through like going to events and constantly finding people, kind of like the way you guys are doing with this podcast, constantly finding interesting people and finding ways to sort of compare and contrast experiences. And I definitely stopped doing that. I became a hermit for probably a good like year or two of the last 4 years. And I definitely lost a lot of the energy that comes with learning from other people in a social setting as a result. And like, I guess I want to stress for you guys and for your listeners that like that trap is very real, and you need to sort of maintain that curiosity and desire to keep meeting people, because obviously like your grad programs are doing that for you to an extent right now. It becomes very on you to go out and continue the search to find more people to work with in the future. So I would just caution people to be wary, and heed some of the advice that other people have given on this podcast before.
You know, I want to pull at that thread that you were talking about there, Roy, about like the networking side of things, and the I want to go more into where you were saying like the hermit area. I think that's like so interesting and so real to talk about. Like Joe and I were talking with you before we went live on the podcast about how like, yeah, we got 6 months, like we're almost done and we're almost about to graduate. And I know Joe and I have spoken on other occasions where it's like once we graduate, the amount of stuff that's on our plate just drops, and like we really are just working. And I know we always are talking on this podcast about like metro events or just going into the city and meeting other IOs or going to psyop. I want to ask you, Rory, for your experience, like when you kind of graduated and then got your job, did you kind of feel the step back away from the networking after that time period, or was it kind of something that happened a little bit later and you like had the momentum die out a little later after you graduated? Because I could totally see it
Uh,
happening. Like I with all the stuff we're doing, I could be wanting to work and put my head down and work.
no, I know. I don't know if I have the most relatable story here, because so I got this job working in people analytics back in January of 2020.
Hmm.
And I had 6 months left in my program, much the way that you guys do now. And so I took the new job, was working here, trying to finish up the program because I was going to Baruch, I was doing night classes. Um, and and then the pandemic hit. And like I was already in a remote job and have been on site a couple of times, but like there's all kinds of other forces at play. But really, I know there are people out there who did a good job of staying connected and continued learning for various reasons. One, like I used to go in person in New York City every single day. I'd see people as I was just commuting. Um, I would go to events in the city and stuff. There was just my classmates that I would see at school. All of that structure kind of disappeared, um, both because I had graduated from school and because I was remote. And it took me a while to realize that, and to realize how important like my overall motivation stemmed from my constant my interaction with people in our field, and just like learning and being surprised and sort of humbled by things that other people are doing, and feeling like, I got to stay relevant, I got to stay competitive and keep up, not because I need to be better than everyone else, but just because I don't know, that those interactions for me inspire a lot of competitive drive and desire to learn. So I realized I had to start doing that myself again, and it took, in all honesty, uh, probably from the pandemic and just other stuff I had going on in my life, it probably took another 18 months from the first time I really thought about that to the time that I really started getting back out there again. Um, and now I just try to make it a habit of like once a month I'll set aside some time to identify a few people on LinkedIn, either that I have already connected with, to reconnect with, or I'll find at least just one new person that I think there's some one interesting thing to send a cold LinkedIn message to, and see if I can get 30 minutes on the calendar just to do an introduction. And that's where I'm at now, and it's been really helpful.
It must have been tough during COVID. I didn't even
Oh
really think
yeah,
about that.
I can
Yeah,
imagine.
Like graduating and then like having your, I guess like your school and your job like out of COVID, and then I mean everyone knows it just hit so fast, and like
yeah,
having
yeah.
to like graduate and go into job. I didn't. That was must have been crazy. But I like what you said about like the cold LinkedIn message. I think like you have. I mean, I know I've done it a whole bunch of times. A whole bunch of other people we know have done it a couple of times. I feel like you have nothing to lose. Like you might as well just like send a LinkedIn message and be like, "Hey, like I'd love to get to know uh, about what you do."
Totally.
Um, it's like a perfect thing, and I feel like most of the time people say yes, because I feel people like to talk about what they do, and especially in the IO space, but just in business in general, people like to help. Because I know I've had a couple of people say to me, they're like, "I know what it's like looking for a job, especially in grad school. Like,
Right.
let me help."
Right. Totally agree. And then maybe this is a tidbit that could be useful for a few people. Like when I do those cold LinkedIn messages, you can, whenever you connect with someone or like try to connect with them and you can personalize the invite. I don't know what you get. It's like 240 characters or something like that. I try to
It's
use
so
all of that
small.
up. Like
Yeah.
I will literally go into like ChatGPT and take what I want to say to this person and get it, be like, come on, help me condense this down to this character down.
Oh, that's smart.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
because like
brilliant.
the thing you need to think about for people, if they're checking LinkedIn, like they might be checking it quickly, and you need to capture their attention very quickly. And so you need to make it really easy for people to understand why they should connect with you. So if you have a couple of things that you've noticed on their profile that you specifically want to talk about, maybe your conversation broadens once you finally do talk to them. But you need to structure the engagement in such a way that the person kind of knows what to expect from this engagement. That kind of takes the anxiety out of it, or makes them feel like, hey, I kind of see what's in this for me. So it's I get people sometimes who will connect with me and there's no message, and I'm completely uninspired to then follow up and ask them what's going on. So whereas on the flip side, if someone says in their message, I want to connect with you about X, Y, and Z, I'm like, let's do it. Let's grab some time.
Oh,
It's so true though. The field itself of IO, we talk about it all the time, is just so giving, and everybody's really trying to push like the information that they're learning because we're all learning at the same time. And I think
Yeah.
every that growth mindset, every like that you speak to you having, Rory, like a lot of us all have that and are all trying to like grow and help the field grow, but the world's changing so fast. Like Joe spoke to it earlier. Like it's crazy what that's like. I want to know from your perspective with like that idea of reaching out to people, like at any point in your career, have you felt like it's always been something that's super beneficial no matter what point you were looking at, whether it's early career advice or even while you're in a position just to get some more knowledge?
Yeah, I definitely would say so. And I think what you learn is like when you were in a position, when you were working in a company, you'll notice that there are some people who are very motivated in terms of like what decisions to make and what to do by benchmarks. And there are other people who are more design oriented and realizing that like the thing we're trying to do actually solves very real problems. Um, and I think it's important to like it is good to benchmark with people just to see what other people are doing, but also to be able to speak to those stakeholders who will want to be like, well, what are other people doing? In my case, in the healthcare space, like what are other people doing in the healthcare space in this regard? What are some of our other peers doing? And whenever I do actually have an answer for that question, which is probably like 30 to 40% of the time, it's helpful. It definitely makes the conversation a little bit warmer when I'm making a recommendation for something for us to do. And then just on the flip side, like with how fast things are moving and everybody coming up with new solutions in their particular business, like there is something that everybody's always doing differently to what you're doing now. At least on more like cutting edge stuff. Like it's just so unstandardized that you need to keep seeing what other people are doing as a means to build off of what they're learning and iterate on your solutions in that way. So yeah, it doesn't matter if you're just starting out. It doesn't matter if you're 5, 10 years into your career. Like there's always really important information to learn from what other people are doing. And sometimes it's good to copy paste what they do into your organization if the context fits, if the problem is the same. But in many cases, it will just help spark some creativity for you.
that's one thing I learned in my current position. I didn't totally realize that like people reached out to other organizations or other like maybe fellow students that they used to have in like a similar space and be like, oh, like how are you doing this specific issue or like
Right.
getting through this process? And then like I clicked, I was like, wait, no, that's like a great idea. I've never even thought about that.
Yeah. Totally.
And I'm definitely stealing your ChatGPT idea for
Oh yeah.
the LinkedIn because I
Oh,
would be in
100%.
there being like, oh, there doesn't need to be a space between these two words just so I could fit in like one extra word. But like you're right, you probably what do? You just probably put the paragraph in and then like say like this needs to be 240 characters, the
Yeah.
same exact thing.
Exactly. I'll take 10 minutes to stare at someone's profile and be like, okay, they seem cool. Or there's like one or two things I really want to ask them about. And I'll bullet out the 5 different things that have come to mind. And it's usually uh, not well written at all. It's just like the stream of consciousness. But I plug it in and give it the context and the task that I need it to do. and then it gives me something back that's like maybe one iteration of what off of what I actually want. But at least it's just made my life a little bit easier and taken one additional step out of the process.
No, it's
I'll have to try
great.
it out.
Yeah.
We're getting so many pieces.
I think we should get into our last question for the evening, the one that we asked all guests. If you could have one or a couple pieces of advice for prospective IO students or just students in general, what do you think it would be?
Yeah, it's probably a couple things. One is a little bit of just a reiteration. It's the networking side and learning from people is probably one of the most fruitful ways that I advance my career at this point. And I constantly tell people like you have to stay connected, you have to make new connections and maintain the ones that you have. Because unfortunately, once grad school's over, as some of my professors used to tell me as well, it's like you might become one of only a couple IOs in an organization, and that's very lonely. And so you have to kind of feed that social learning side of you that not everybody has, like to the greatest extent, but everybody does need to learn from each other, whether you want to admit it or not. So I constantly tell people to keep networking long after you got out of school, because you just it's hard to appreciate how much structure and support you actually get from your grad program in that way. It's just hard to see right now. You'll feel it once you're out.
It's good though. The networking piece is so important. Like we were talking about this, how it's like people are so willing to help, and just talking about your idea of how you can make a really helpful first initial reach out message. Like those types of things are super important, especially what for like young either students or professionals who are trying to advance their careers. But the great thing about the networking piece is that it's career long. Like it's something that's going to benefit you like all the way through your career. Like
Right.
Joe and I have had so many different types of professionals on this podcast, and all of them are consistently networking no matter what point they're at in their career. Like, so
Yeah.
Rory, your advice is like something that's going to last over time for anybody.
Totally. Actually, maybe this is a good add-on, and I don't think this is exactly what the other point was beforehand, but like I think as well, when I came into this role, I was think about what we learn in a grad program. It's often what are the methods that we need to get stuff done, and it becomes very easy to fall in love with like whatever solution that you're building to help an organization with, whether it's improving a selection system, L&D stuff, org effectiveness stuff. Like it becomes very easy to get focused on getting that just right and getting it just perfect. And nowadays, with just so many different problems coming up, I think people, at least in my organization and many other large organizational contexts where I talk to people, like the whole concept of like really understanding a problem, understanding what people do and where the gap is between what they do and where they need to go, is the more is the thing that people need to be focused on and need to use as an effective tool to help them prioritize where they're going to spend their time. In fact, one book that I'm reading right now that I think is it's I'm listening to it as an audiobook, but it's been really informative, is a book called The Mom Test, and it's a book this guy wrote with an eye towards helping people understand if someone thinks your idea is good, whether it's a business idea or a feature for a solution that you're presenting. He basically says, like, if you pitch your business idea to your mom, she's always going to say it's a good idea. She's going to totally protect like your ego and make sure that like, oh yeah, like this is a great idea. But in the IO world, when you're out there in the business world, like people do that too. Like if you ask lots of hypothetical questions, and you're not really trying to ground yourself in what their problems are, of like, oh, would this be helpful? Would that be helpful? If you had to do this, would you do that? Those questions don't often get you very far. And so for anyone who reads this book, it'll talk a little bit about like how do you ask people questions that get them very focused on the problems that they have and ways they've actually tried to solve it. And I'd recommend it to anyone else as a way to help you learn to ask the right questions. I think that is one of my biggest gripes as far as career advice goes, is the fact that like two things I find are way too general. Saying fall in love with the problem and not the solution without actually suggesting how to do that, I think is terrible advice, because it leaves you wondering, okay, how do I actually do that? And And two is people saying like, oh, you just have to ask the right questions. I feel like I hear that on all these panels with more senior leaders in the IO space. It's like you gotta asking the right questions, and that's all, and that's how you prioritize the right things for maximum business impact. And I'm like, yeah, but nobody's really told me how to do that. Are you telling me I just need to get 4 or 5 years of experience to learn how to do that? And they're like, no, give me some ideas to work with here. So I want to offer that up to people in case it helps them as they're trying to figure out how to scope problems out when they're actually in the working world.
No, it's great advice, and I feel like it's unique too. We haven't had someone go that in depth about certain processes before, which
Yeah.
which is great.
Yeah, it's
Definitely
awesome.
not complaining,
Yeah,
um, but especially that networking piece, it's vital. Like we've talked about it throughout this podcast. We talked about it in other episodes too. It is easy to fall, out of the void and just kind of like, all right, I don't need to network anymore. But as Brandon said before, it's so important. It really
yeah,
is.
yeah. Especially with so much more work out there now.
Yeah, and like we always touch on it, so it's great that like it's something that keeps coming up because then hopefully we're reinforcing that idea in people's minds. And I mean, if Joe and I can do a podcast like this, like it kind of speaks to the idea that like just we're just two students at Hofstra, so like for us to be able to reach out to people and get them out here, like anyone can do that at any time that they want.
Totally, totally.
But yeah, thanks for coming on, Rory. I think people are definitely going to benefit from this episode. Um, you did some great things since you graduated, some great pieces of advice. I'm excited for people to hear it.
Yeah, we really appreciate it, Rory.
Awesome. Glad I could help.
Yeah, great. See ya.
Take care.
All right, thanks, guys.
Great way to start the year off, Joe. Rory was an awesome guest. I feel like every single tidbit he was giving us was a piece of advice or something that we can take with us with our careers.
No, absolutely. It was a great way to start off the new year. This episode has been long running. I know he said, I think we booked it back in like November or something like that. But it was worth every second. It was definitely great getting to talk to Rory. He does some really cool things at GE.
Yeah, and it's cool too because you can kind of see like to be like a senior position, 4 years, 5 years post graduation, like to be in that type of role, like you have to have a mindset of not only like learning but networking, and you can tell he kind of shows that energy there, and it's really inspiring. I feel like for us young early career people to look at and see like, okay, this is the type of energy we have to do this with once we graduate.
No, absolutely. His piece on networking, and just his overall like productivity, I guess you could say, it was inspiring. But thank you everybody for listening, and hopefully we catch you next week.
Yep, catch you guys next week.